Okay, so now we're going to move on to myths of origins. And again, I have all the information is on the slide right away. But just remember, we're going to go through it slowly. Um, so last in the last slide in historical overview, we talked about the beginning of Islam as a historical religious tradition, right? That Islam starts as a religious tradition with the life of Muhammad and the revelations that he receives. But Islam, of course, as with all the other religious traditions that we've studied, traces its origins back much farther. So Islam understands itself as starting with the beginning of the world, with the creation of the world. Um, so within the Quran, so the sacred text of Islam is called the Quran. There is a story about the creation of the world, and it's in a lot of ways it's very similar to the creation story, the creation myth from Judaism and Christianity. Because remember, there's they use the same creation myth because Christianity includes the Torah, the Jewish scripture within their own Bible. So, and we'll talk more in the second part of this slide about why it's so similar. So, according to the Quran, God creates the world. He creates the world in 7 days, just like in the Torah creation myth. So he creates the world. He populates the world, everything in it. Creates human beings, the first two human beings who are named Adam and Eve, and he creates a garden for them, the Garden of Eden. So they live in the Garden of Eden, and God tells them, you can eat from any tree that you want, but you can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So you can see there, up till now, there's a lot of similarities in the story. And just the same, Adam and Eve end up disobeying God, and they eat the fruit. But at this point, the stories start to differ. There's some significant differences in the story. In the Quranic version of the story, Adam and Eve eat the fruit at the same time. So it's not like Eve eats it first and then gives it to Adam. They both eat the fruit at the same time. God finds out, of course, that they ate the fruit. He confronts them. He is very upset that they disobeyed him. And Adam and Eve feel very repentant. They feel remorse for what they've done. They ask God for forgiveness, and God forgives them. And that part of the story, that's really the end of that part of the story. So you can see the difference there. Within the Quranic version of the story, there's not like certain punishments that come into the world or that are applied to all of humanity because of what Adam and Eve did. And there's no doctrine of original sin in Islam, just like in Judaism. Instead, the story is seen as sort of setting up a pattern for how humans behave in this world. Humans, they ate the fruit, so they know the difference between good and evil. So they have a choice. Throughout their lives, humans can choose between doing what is right and doing what is wrong. And they know the difference between right and wrong. They are inevitably going to do wrong. They are inevitably going to screw up, just like Adam and Eve did. But when they do that, they need to, repent to God, ask God for forgiveness, and God will forgive them. So it's just sort of kind of seen as an archetypal narrative that human beings continue to repeat. So the next bullet point that I have here is free will and the right path. So another aspect of the creation story is that when God's creating the world, he's creating every single aspect of the world, the heavens and the earth, the sun, the moon, the stars, all the animals, all the plants, all living beings in the world, humans, angels. And as he's creating each one of these species, each one of these aspects of creation, he gives them a choice. He asks them, when I'm creating you, do you want me to create you so that you naturally submit to my will? You just automatically live according to the will of God? Or would you rather have free will so that you can decide whether or not to submit to God, follow the will of God, or to do something else, to not do that? And according to the Quran, every aspect of creation, all species, all, the planets and the stars and every aspect of creation says, no, I don't want that free will thing. That sounds kind of scary. I want you to create me so that I just naturally submit to God's plan and God's will. The only aspect of creation that raises their hand, right, and says, yes, we want that free will, you can probably guess it's humans. So human beings are seen as the only aspect of creation that have free will. We have a choice in this life. Everything else in the world, all of nature, all of creation, is actually already Muslim. The world itself is Muslim because the world submits to the will of God. So, we in the animal world, we call it instinct. In the natural world, we call it science. We call it the natural laws of science. And that is the will of God. All of creation just does what it's supposed to do. Plants do what they're supposed to do. Animals do what they're supposed to do. So they are naturally Muslim. They are naturally following the will of God. Human beings, we have free will. We have a choice in this life. So the idea of life in Islam is that we have to choose the right path. Because of that free will, life becomes a choice, right? Throughout our lives, we have to make the right choice. We have to choose the right path. And really the choice is who or what are we going to submit to? Remember that Islam means submission or surrender, and Muslim just means someone who submits or surrenders to God. And the idea in Islam is that everyone submits to something. Everyone surrenders to something. We have a choice of what we're going to submit or surrender to. We can submit or surrender to God, and that's of course the path of Islam. But some people only submit to themselves, right? I make all decisions for myself. I only submit to my own will. Some people may submit themselves to other people. They may, follow someone, follow a leader, and submit themselves to that. Some people may submit themselves to an ideology or a political belief system, and other people may submit themselves to money or to success. So our lives are guided, everyone's life is guided by something. So what are we going to choose to submit to or to be guided by? So in Islam, that's the idea of human life. Human life while we're here, the idea is to make the right choice, and the right choice is to submit to the will of God. But another idea in Islam is that we don't naturally know, the nature of God, what God is like, or how to submit to God, right? The choice in life is whether or not to submit to the will of God, to follow God, but we need information. We need more information in order to do that. So throughout history, God has sent prophets into the world. So God chooses individuals, gives those individuals this information. This is what God is like, and this is how to live a life according to the will of God. And that's how human beings know. That's how they can have that information. So Adam and Eve, also another difference in the Quranic version of the story. Adam and Eve are not kicked out of the garden. They're not banished from the garden for what they did. They're sent into the world to tell people about God. So Adam is the first prophet. He's the first person that God says, you know God now. You've had a relationship with God. So you need to go tell people what God is like and how to live according to his will. So this lineage of prophets has been going on since the very beginning of time. According to the Quran, there have been 124,000 prophets. So every time period, every country, every culture has had their prophets. That in those societies, God has chosen individuals. He gives messages to those individuals, and then they speak the messages to the community so that the community knows how to worship God and how to live a life according to God's will. So the Quran says that there's been all these prophets, 124,000 prophets, but it doesn't tell the story of each of these 124,000 prophets. It just says that there's been this large number of prophets. The Quran actually talks about 26 of them. So there's 26 prophets who are named in the Quran, and stories about them are given. So the lineage of prophets goes from Adam to Muhammad. So Muhammad is the last prophet, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But in between, there is Abraham, Moses, Noah, Joseph, Jesus, John the Baptist, so many more, so many more that I can't think of right now. But if you remember our unit on Judaism and Christianity, these names are familiar, right? So they're the same prophets from the Torah, from the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, as well as the New Testament. So remember when we started the unit, we said that Islam sees itself as the continuation and the completion of the religious story that starts with Judaism, continues in Christianity, and then ends with Islam. So there's a lot of similar stories in the Quran as in the Torah and the New Testament because it sees those same individuals as prophets. So that's a reason that there's so much overlap. There's a lot of similar stories and similar figures in the Quran as in those other two texts. But Muhammad here, the next bullet point that I have is that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. And I'll say that doesn't mean like SeaWorld. It means like if you've seen movies about medieval times or something, when they have like a scroll or a letter, they put a wax seal on it. They heat up a piece of wax and use that to close the letter, to seal the letter. So that's the meaning of that phrase. He's the seal of the prophets because he's putting like the final stamp on that lineage. So he is closing that lineage, closing that line of prophets. And so there's not going to be any more prophets. So Muhammad is important because he's the final prophet. So there's not going to be any more after him. And there's not going to be any more after him because Muslims believe that the revelation that Muhammad received was complete. It, nothing is missing from it. It was, all the information that human beings need in order to understand God and to live a life according to God's will. And it was also a perfect revelation. So the revelation was recorded perfectly without any mistakes. So that's another reason that there's so much overlap between the Torah, the New Testament, and the Quran. So Muslims believe that the Torah and the New Testament are sacred texts. They're sacred texts because they are texts written about true prophets of God. Right? All the prophets in the Old Testament are also prophets in the Islamic tradition. Jesus is also a very important prophet within Islam. So those texts are very important and they are sacred because they are about these true prophets of God who, had true messages from God that they revealed to their communities. However, Muslims also believe that in the process of compiling those texts and then passing those texts down through the generations, mistakes and errors crept into those texts. So because it took such a long time for them to be written down, the Torah took about 1,000 years to be written. It was written, over hundreds of years by several different authors, and it took a long time for it to come together in its finalized version. The New Testament was written over about 100 years, and it took about 400 years for it to be compiled in its final version. That Muslims believe because of that fact, the information in them can't be verified, and that there are mistakes. There are mistakes that crept into them just because of that process of canonization, of people writing them down after such a long period of time, and then passing them down through handwritten documents. So there will be the same story. There could be the same story in the Torah as in the Quran, or the New Testament and the Quran. But Muslims believe that the Quranic version of that story is the corrected version of that story. So the version that got into the final version of the Torah and the final version of the Bible, by that time it had errors in it. It had mistakes in it. So a story like the one we just talked about, the story of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve and what happens to them after they eat the fruit, Muslims would look to a story like that that's in the Quran and say that's the correct version of the story. And that, the version in the Torah, that the differences, the parts that are different, those are the incorrect parts. So Muhammad is also the last prophet because a lot of his revelation was the corrections of the mistakes that got into the Torah and the New Testament. So he's the last prophet also because the revelation is seen to be perfect. That there's a belief in Islam that the line of transmission was not corrupted. So from God's mouth to the text of the Quran is a perfect, unbroken line of transmission. Therefore, every single word in the Quran, as long as it's in Arabic, which we'll talk more about, every single word in the Quran is the actual word that God spoke. That through, God telling that to the angel Gabriel, the angel Gabriel telling it to Muhammad, Muhammad reciting it to his community, and then his community memorizing it or writing it down, then compiling it after his death, that no mistakes got into that process. So the Quran has the correct versions of all of those stories. So there's stories about Adam and Eve, there's stories about Abraham, stories about Moses, stories about Noah, stories about Joseph, stories about Jesus. But the Quranic versions of that story, wherever they're different from the Torah or the New Testament, are seen to be the corrections, that is the Quranic version is the true version of the story. So that's another reason why Muhammad is the last prophet. There's no need for any more prophets because the revelation is complete and the revelation is perfect. It was perfectly recorded, so there doesn't need to be someone else down the line who corrects the mistakes of the Quran, for example. So that's the idea of the prophets. So again, the prophets started with Adam, went through 124,000 people total, although we don't know most of those people, and then it ends with Muhammad. Muhammad is the final prophet. Then the last point that I have down here, Abraham and Ishmael. So many of you have probably heard people call Judaism, Christianity, and Islam the Abrahamic religions or the Abrahamic faiths. And that's because all three of those traditions trace their lineage back to Abraham. Sometimes in a more literal way, sometimes in a more spiritual way. Jews consider themselves descendants of Abraham, and in a pretty literal way. Right? That's why Judaism is not just a religion, it's also a people, because for the most part, Jews are born into the tradition. Christians also see themselves sort of linked to Abraham, not necessarily in like an actual biological way, but since they see themselves as the fulfillment of Judaism, they still see Abraham as sort of the progenitor of their tradition, or the sort of example of faith, something like that. Muslims also trace their lineage back to Abraham, in both a more literal and a spiritual way. But it's through a different family lineage. So Jews and Christians trace their lineage back to Abraham through Abraham's second son, whose name is Isaac, that he had with his wife Sarah. So we'll go through sort of the two versions of the story, how they're similar and how they're different. So just to know that Jews and Christians trace their lineage back to Abraham, but through Abraham's second son Isaac that he had with Sarah. So there's another part of the story in the Torah, and it's also in the Quran, that we didn't talk about when we went through Judaism. We talked about how Abraham was the first individual to have a covenant with God, and in order, or sort of in return for following God, God gives Abraham and his wife Sarah a very special promise for something that they've wanted for a long time, which is children. that they will have a son and they will have, many children and descendants. So Abraham and Sarah are very excited about that. They very much want to have children. But according to the Torah, Sarah does not become pregnant right away. It takes a long time. And as she's not getting pregnant, she starts to kind of have a crisis of faith. And she tells Abraham, her husband, maybe when God promised you that, he didn't mean through me. And remember, Abraham and Sarah are very old at this time. She's well past, normal childbearing years. So she asks Abraham actually to sleep with her servant. There's a woman that works for the family. She's much younger. And Sarah asks Abraham to sleep with her. And Abraham does. And Sarah becomes, Hagar, her name is Hagar. Hagar becomes pregnant. And Hagar is pregnant with a boy. She has a son, and his son is Ishmael. So that's the Torah version of the story, and the Torah version of the story sort of ends with Sarah actually changes her mind afterwards. She gets very jealous, and she asks Abraham to banish Hagar and Ishmael to the desert to kick them out of their tribe, and Abraham agrees. He says, okay, we shouldn't have done that. That was a mistake, and they banish them to the desert. Which in a tribal desert society is very dangerous because there's not a lot of resources out there if you don't live with a community that can help you. But the story sort of ends with an angel appearing to Hagar and Ishmael, saying that God knows about your plight and knows about your struggle, and God's going to take care of you. So don't worry, you guys will be fine, and God will take care of you. The Quran has a little bit of a different version. So there are some similarities, there's some differences. So the Quranic version of the story, basically Abraham has two wives. He has a wife, Sarah, who has Isaac, and he also has a wife, Hagar, who has Ishmael. And in the Quranic version of the story, Abraham is actually told by God to leave Hagar and Ishmael in a certain location in the desert. So he does that. He leaves them there. God asks him to do that, so he does. But later on, he goes back to them. He goes back to Hagar and Ishmael, and he raises Ishmael and is a family with them. So the difference in the two stories, in the Torah version of the story, Abraham basically, we don't really hear about Hagar and Ishmael again after we see them in the desert. And then Abraham, goes back to Sarah. Sarah becomes pregnant. She has her son Isaac, and Jews and Christians trace their lineage through Isaac. Isaac has a son Jacob, and the rest of the patriarchs come through that line. In the Quranic version of the story, Abraham, has Ishmael with Hagar, and eventually returns to them. Goes back to living with them as a family, and they are actually living in the area that will become Mecca. So they live in Mecca a long time before Muhammad did. Abraham and Ishmael, during that time, they are also visited by an angel. They're visited by the angel Gabriel. And that angel asks Abraham and Ishmael to build a house of worship to God. To build the one house of worship to the one God. So they do. They create a structure according to God's instructions. Gabriel also gives them a stone. So they want you to use this stone as the cornerstone for the building. So they use that stone, and that building is the Kaaba. So according to Islam, that place is sacred because it was actually Abraham and Ishmael who built that structure. So if you remember, the Kaaba was already around when Muhammad was living. And people in Mecca just kind of remembered that it was like a sacred place. It was some sort of special place. And that's why people house their idols there, their statues of their gods there. But according to Islam, the people that lived in that area had actually forgotten the true meaning and the true story behind that structure. but the true story is actually that Abraham and Ishmael built it to be a house of worship to the one God, after God requested them to do that. So that's why the Kaaba is the most sacred place for Islams in the world today. For Muslims in the world today. And we'll talk more about the Kaaba, the city of Mecca, and rituals that are oriented towards that place. Okay, so a lot of story for the myths of origins. And then next we're going to go on to talk about the historical myths, some important events that happen in Muhammad's life and right afterwards.